Hello everyone, quick question. Have you ever discovered a loved one was hiding a serious health issue until it was almost too late? Share your experience in the comments. Last midnight, a doctor who was forced to conceal Diddy's HIV diagnosis finally spoke out, and what he revealed could change everything we thought we knew. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The Late Night Arrival. Nights at Brooklyn Hospital always felt different. The daytime chaos faded into a thick, almost oppressive quiet, with only the occasional beeping machines or the murmured conversations of nurses breaking the silence. I had learned to appreciate that silence. Most nights, it meant fewer emergencies, fewer reasons to be pulled into something I didn't want to deal with. But tonight felt off. I noticed it the moment I stepped out of the break room. There was a strange, nervous energy in the air. Nurses moved quickly, their voices lower than usual, and when I made my way down the hall, I caught the briefest glances exchanged between staff members, like they knew something I didn't. Then I heard it, the rumbling sound of heavy engines outside, coming from the hospital's back entrance. I didn't need to see it to know what it was. Prison transport vehicles. It wasn't the first time we'd had an inmate brought in, but it was never this discreet, never this tense. Normally, there'd be routine security measures, an officer filling out paperwork at the front desk while the patient was wheeled in with minimal fuss. But this? No announcement, no preparation, just quiet movements, tense faces, and a deliberate effort to keep it low-key. I kept walking, glancing toward the security desk near the entrance. The guards posted there, two stocky men with stiff postures and alert eyes, looked different too. They weren't just standing guard, they were on guard, watching everything, scanning every face. By the time I reached the back hall, the doors were already opening. The blast of cold night air sent a chill down the corridor as two paramedics wheeled in the patient. At first, I only saw the thin gray blanket wrapped around his body, covering most of his face, making him look smaller than he should have been. Then, the blanket shifted, and my stomach twisted at what I saw. I knew who he was before anyone said his name. The cheekbones were unmistakable, even with the hollowness beneath them. The frame, though shrunken now, still carried a ghost of the presence he once had. The man beneath the blanket was Sean Combs, Diddy. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought they had brought in the wrong person. The photos, the videos, the public image, none of it matched what I was looking at now. His skin was yellowish, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. The sweat was thick on his forehead, even though it was freezing outside. His jumpsuit, the standard issue orange from MDC Brooklyn, hung loosely from his body. He had lost a shocking amount of weight, and his breathing was shallow, like every inhale took more effort than it should. One of the paramedics, a young woman with tired eyes, caught my gaze. She shook her head ever so slightly, a barely there movement before glancing at the guards standing behind the gurney. A warning. I stepped closer, trying to get a better look. The smell hit me before I even touched him. That sickly sweet scent, sweat mixed with something else, something unnatural. Diddy mumbled something under his breath. His lips barely moved, and whatever he was saying was too low for me to catch. "Vitals?" I asked. One of the paramedics hesitated before handing over the chart. I scanned it quickly. Fever, extreme weight loss, profuse sweating, joint pain. The usual box for underlying conditions was left blank. "Has he been diagnosed with anything?" I asked, flipping through the pages. The prison officer closest to me shifted uncomfortably. He was a big guy with a bulletproof vest stretching over his chest, and he refused to meet my eyes. "You'll have to talk to MDC's medical staff about that," he muttered. I frowned. "Well, according to this, your medical staff didn't send over half of what they were supposed to." I lifted the clipboard slightly. "Where's his last blood work? Any prior hospitalization records?" "Just do your job, Doc," another officer grumbled. "Not your concern." I exhaled slowly, suppressing my irritation. This was standard protocol. Every patient was supposed to arrive with complete medical records. The fact that his were missing wasn't just sloppy, it was deliberate. I turned back to Diddy. His eyes were half open now, barely slits, but there was awareness in them, the kind that made my skin crawl. "What do you need?" I asked him, keeping my voice even. He let out a weak chuckle, barely above a whisper. Then he exhaled through his nose and muttered something I almost didn't catch. "They said..." He swallowed hard, voice raspy. "They said I'd be fine." I felt the hair on my arms rise. "Who?" I pressed, but his eyes were already fluttering closed again. I looked at the nurses standing nearby. No one moved, no one spoke. Then from behind me a low voice said, "Don't ask too many questions, Doc." I turned. It was Marjorie, one of the senior nurses. She was in her 60s, had been working here for decades, and she was one of the few people in this place I actually respected. She had seen everything. Every cover-up, every high-profile case, every thing that was supposed to be off the record. She was watching me now, expression unreadable. "Just treat him," she said, "and leave it at that." Her voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something that wasn't a suggestion. I took another look at Diddy's face, at the way his fingers twitched slightly against the edge of the blanket, the way his body seemed to shrink into itself. I glanced back at the missing medical files, the prison officers refusing to answer, the nurses acting like they already knew something I didn't. And then I realized something. They weren't just nervous. They were scared. And that told me everything I needed to know. Chapter 2. The test results. They didn't want me to see. The fluorescent lights in the examination room buzzed faintly, casting a pale, clinical glow over everything. The air inside felt heavier than it should, carrying the sterile scent of antiseptic and something else, something stale, something that lingered in the corners, unnoticed by most but sharp enough to settle uneasily in the back of my throat. I stood near the counter, reviewing the incomplete file they had sent with Diddy, flipping through the pages with growing frustration. It wasn't just the missing records that bothered me. It was the fact that no one wanted to acknowledge they were missing at all. Every time I asked a question, I was met with silence or vague responses. I took a deep breath, trying to push back the unease creeping up my spine. The next step was simple, standard protocol. Order a full panel of tests and get some actual answers. If the prison refused to provide information, I'd get it myself. I jotted down the orders on the chart. Blood work, metabolic panel, liver function, CD4 count. The last one wasn't routine, but something about this case told me to dig deeper. The weight loss, the sweating, the weakness, all of it pointed to something more than just fatigue. A soft knock at the door pulled my attention, and when I turned, Olivia was standing there, looking paler than usual. Olivia had been a nurse at Brooklyn Hospital for almost 5 years, and while she was still young, she wasn't the type to get rattled easily. Yet, as she stepped forward, I noticed her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the tourniquet around her wrist, her gaze flickering to Diddy, who lay still on the examination table, staring at the ceiling with an expression I couldn't quite place. "I'll draw the blood," she said, her voice carefully even, but I could hear the tightness in it. She was nervous. I watched as she prepped the needle, but it was the slight hesitation in her hands that made my stomach tighten. I had seen Olivia work before. She was precise, steady, but tonight, her movements were careful in a way that didn't seem natural, almost as if she was afraid to touch him. Diddy shifted slightly, his eyes flicking toward her, then up at me, his lips curled just barely, something resembling amusement in the way his expression softened. The weight loss might have drained him physically, but his presence still carried something unsettling, something calculating, the way he looked at people, not as if he was acknowledging them, but as if he was sizing them up. "Don't be scared, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice hoarse but still laced with something that almost sounded like a joke. Almost. Olivia's hand jerked slightly, but she kept her focus on the task, sliding the needle into his arm, watching as the dark blood filled the vials. Diddy didn't even flinch. I cleared my throat, stepping closer, flipping through the blank spaces in his file. "Mr. Combs, do you have any pre-existing conditions I should be aware of?" I asked, my voice neutral. A long silence stretched between us before he finally turned his head toward me. His eyes were sharp now, focused. Not weak, not out of it, just aware. He smirked, not a big one, but enough. "What do you think, Doc?" His voice was low, almost amused, like he was enjoying the game more than anything. I exhaled slowly, refusing to react. "I'm asking because whatever's going on with you, fatigue, weight loss, joint pain, it's not something I can just treat without understanding your history. You know that." His smirk didn't fade. If anything, it deepened slightly, like he had just heard something funny. He exhaled through his nose, closing his eyes for a moment before whispering, "They said it wouldn't get this bad." Something in my chest tightened at those words. I glanced at Olivia, who had frozen slightly, her eyes flicking to me as if asking if I heard it too. Before I could press further, one of the guards, the same one who had refused to answer my questions earlier, stepped forward. "You're done, right?" His voice was sharper this time, more impatient. I didn't like the way he said it. I didn't like the way all of them seemed more tense now that the blood had been drawn. "I'll be done when the tests come back," I said, keeping my tone even. The guard didn't respond. He just stared at me for a long moment before nodding once, not in agreement. A warning. The test results arrived less than an hour later. I was in the doctor's lounge, reviewing another patient's file, when my laptop screen flashed with the incoming report. Clicking it open, I leaned forward, expecting nothing more than standard abnormalities. Electrolyte imbalances, maybe signs of an underlying infection. But what I saw made my stomach drop. Several key markers were dangerously abnormal. White blood cell count shockingly low, platelets barely holding, and the numbers that truly made my breath hitch. CD4 count drastically reduced. It was the kind of count you'd see in a patient with severe immune suppression, the kind of numbers that weren't just bad, they were catastrophic. Then my eyes landed on the final confirmation: HIV antibodies present. I stared at the screen, fingers tightening around the edge of the table. There was no doubt, no room for speculation. Diddy wasn't just sick, he was dying. A notification flashed on the screen. Access restricted. File locked. I blinked, straightening slightly. That wasn't normal. The system never locked patient files unless manually overridden by hospital administration. I clicked again, same result. I couldn't print it. I couldn't share it. Someone had already intervened. The realization sent a slow chill down my spine. Someone in this hospital, someone with authority, didn't want these results going anywhere. Before I could process the implications, the door swung open. I turned just in time to see Dr. Harrington, the hospital administrator, stepping in. He was a man in his 50s, graying at the temples, always neatly pressed, always professional. But tonight there was something off about him. His shoulders were tight, his jaw set. "Michael," his voice was clipped, direct. "I need you to rerun the tests." I exhaled slowly, tilting my head. "What's wrong with these ones?" "They were compromised," he said flatly. "Compromised how?" "Just do them again." Something about the way he said it made my hands curl into fists. I leaned back in my chair, meeting his gaze. "You saw the results, didn't you?" He didn't answer right away, and that told me everything. I should have expected this. I knew how hospitals worked, how pressure from outside forces could make medical ethics bend. But this was something else. This wasn't just influence, this was control. Dr. Harrington sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Michael, listen to me. This goes higher than you think. Run the tests again, get new results, and then..." His voice dropped slightly. "Forget about the first ones." I stared at him, my heart thudding in my chest. He met my gaze one more time, something like regret flickering in his expression. "You don't want to get involved in this." Then he turned and walked out, leaving me alone with the truth and the terrifying realization that I might be the only one willing to acknowledge it. Chapter 3. The Call from the Shadows. The hospital was never truly quiet even at this hour. Machines beeped rhythmically in the distance, the soft shuffle of footsteps echoed down empty halls, and the hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence like static in the air. But despite all of that, something about this night felt different, like a presence was lurking just beneath the surface, just out of sight. I sat in the dim glow of my office, the computer screen still open to the test results I wasn't supposed to see. The numbers were burned into my brain now. CD4 count dangerously low, immune system shot, HIV antibodies confirmed. And the manual lockdown of the file. Who had done that? Who had seen the results before me? Who had the power to make it disappear? I didn't know how long I had been staring at the screen, but I knew I wasn't going to sleep anytime soon, not with this hanging over me. The conversation with Dr. Harrington still played on a loop in my head. He hadn't just been concerned, he had been afraid. And whatever or whoever was behind this was powerful enough to make a hospital administrator personally intervene. A part of me wanted to do exactly what he had suggested, rerun the tests, pretend this never happened, move on with my life. But another part of me knew I had already gone too far. I had seen what I wasn't supposed to see. There was no undoing that. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the phone on my desk rang. The sound sliced through the quiet, shrill and abrupt. I blinked, my pulse skipping a beat before I exhaled sharply, reaching for the receiver. "This is Dr. Greer," I said, keeping my voice level. For a moment there was silence. A long, empty pause that stretched on just a little too long. Not static, not breathing, just nothing. Then, finally, a voice, low, cold, measured. "Drop it." I stiffened. "Who is this?" The line clicked off. No goodbye, no background noise, no trace of a caller ID, just the heavy silence pressing in around me. I lowered the phone back onto the receiver, staring at it for a long moment. I wasn't imagining this. Someone knew I had seen the test results, and whoever they were, they didn't want me looking any further. I pushed back from my desk, rubbing a hand down my face, my skin suddenly clammy. I had worked in hospitals long enough to know when something was bigger than it seemed. This wasn't just a medical case. This was something deeper, something controlled, something that went beyond the walls of Brooklyn Hospital. The feeling in my gut was the same one I had when Diddy first arrived, the suffocating sense that everyone around me already knew something I didn't. I needed to check on him. When I stepped into his room, I expected him to be asleep. Most patients, especially those in his condition, didn't have the energy to stay awake. But Diddy was sitting up in his bed, his posture eerily straight, his hands resting lightly on the thin hospital blanket covering his legs. He turned his head slightly when he heard me enter, his eyes catching the dim glow of the hallway lights. He looked more awake than he had before, more present, but there was something different in his expression now, something that made my chest tighten. He wasn't scared, he wasn't confused. He was amused. "You ever wonder, Doc," he said, his voice rasping but still carrying that familiar rhythm, "what it's like to know something before everyone else does?" I hesitated, watching him carefully. His gaze was sharp, focused, not at all like someone on the verge of collapse. I took a step closer, checking the IV running into his arm. He hadn't been eating, but his vitals were stronger than they should have been. "What do you mean?" I asked. Diddy chuckled softly, shaking his head. His fingers twitched against the blanket, the only outward sign of whatever restlessness had settled in his body. "It don't matter. he muttered. None of it does. I frowned. What doesn't matter? He exhaled sharply, still smiling faintly. This, me, the doctors, the tests, you. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time since he arrived, I felt like he was the one examining me. A shiver ran through me. I had seen patients give up before. I had seen them withdraw, sink into the realization that they were dying, but this was different. This wasn't acceptance. This was certainty. You've refused food since you got here, I said, my voice measured. Your body is shutting down, but you don't seem surprised. You knew, didn't you? Diddy didn't respond. He just watched me, that faint, knowing smirk still tugging at the corner of his mouth. You knew, I repeated, stepping closer. How long? Another long silence stretched between us. Then, finally, he blinked slowly and said, Long enough. The air in the room felt heavier, like an invisible pressure pressing down on my shoulders. I glanced at his chart, flipping through the pages, searching for something, anything that confirmed a previous diagnosis, but there was nothing. No history of HIV treatment, no records of any prior hospitalizations for related symptoms, which meant one of two things. Either this was his first official diagnosis, or it had been hidden for years. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. If he had been diagnosed before, someone had gone to extreme lengths to erase any trace of it. My pulse quickened. Have you been treated for this before? I asked, watching him closely. Diddy just smiled. You're asking the wrong questions. I exhaled slowly, closing the file. My mind was spinning, piecing together what little I had, trying to make sense of a puzzle where half the pieces were missing. The phone call, the missing records, the administrator's warning, everything pointed to the same conclusion. Someone had known about his condition long before tonight, and now they were making sure no one else did. I left the room without another word, my mind racing. I needed answers, real ones. If there were no official records of a prior diagnosis, then I needed to look elsewhere. I needed to find someone, anyone, who had treated him before. There had to be a doctor, a specialist, someone who had been in my position before. I made my way down the hall, my thoughts so loud in my head that I almost didn't notice the nurse's station up ahead. Olivia was still there, sitting behind the counter, tapping nervously against a clipboard. When she saw me, she straightened, her expression tight. You heard, didn't you? She murmured. I frowned. Heard what? She hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Some of the senior staff said something earlier. About a doctor, someone who treated him before. My heart kicked against my ribs. Who? She swallowed, glancing around like she was afraid of being overheard. Leonard Strauss. The name hit me like a cold gust of wind. I recognized it immediately. Dr. Leonard Strauss was a former private physician, a specialist who had handled several high-profile clients. And then one day he disappeared. No formal resignation, no record of where he went. Just gone. I felt the weight of the hospital phone call pressing against my thoughts again. Drop it. I had a feeling Dr. Strauss had gotten the same call. And if he was gone now, that only left me with one question. How much time did I have before I disappeared too? Chapter 4. The Doctor Who Disappeared. By the time I made it back to my office, my mind was racing. The name Olivia had whispered to me. Dr. Leonard Strauss. Felt like the missing piece I had been waiting for. Someone had treated Diddy before. Someone had known about this long before I did, and now that person was nowhere to be found. I logged into the hospital's internal database, my fingers hovering over the keyboard for a second longer than necessary. A part of me already knew what I was going to find, or rather, what I wasn't going to find, but I had to try. I typed in Leonard Strauss. Nothing. Not a single active listing. No employment records, no termination files, no retirement notices. It was as if he had never worked here at all. I exhaled through my nose, trying to tamp down the frustration rising in my chest. Doctors didn't just disappear. Even if someone retired or left the medical field, there was always some trace of them. A past email, a leftover record, a procedural note buried deep in the system. So I tried another route. I typed in Sean Combs. Immediately, a patient profile appeared, but it was bare bones. No prior admissions, no history of medical treatment, no listed conditions. Just the generic information that had been provided when he was admitted last night. But then, buried at the bottom of the file, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. A flagged entry from 3 years ago. I clicked it open. Patient evaluation conducted off-site. Private consultation. Physician, L. Strauss. My pulse kicked up. This was it. A connection. The file itself wasn't detailed. There were no lab reports, no prescriptions, no test results attached. Just a single note from Dr. Strauss himself. Patient insists symptoms are minor, recommends discretion, urges confidentiality. The air in my office suddenly felt too thin. This wasn't just a routine checkup. Dr. Strauss had been treating him privately, and someone had deliberately kept it off the record. I needed to find him. The first number I found was disconnected. The second went straight to voicemail. The third, his supposed personal line, rang once before an automated message played. This number is no longer in service. I leaned back in my chair, pressing my fingers against my temples. Where the hell was this guy? Doctors, especially high-profile ones, didn't just vanish. They either moved on to better positions or retired with full honors. But Strauss? It was like he had been erased. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search. There were a few scattered mentions, medical journal entries from years ago, a couple of awards for outstanding research. Then, abruptly, nothing. His last known job had been a private practice in Manhattan. Then, 2 years ago, it shut down overnight. No announcements, no patient transfers, no explanation. That didn't happen. Ever. I checked public records, court filings, anything that might explain where he went, but there was no lawsuit, no malpractice case, nothing that would force him into hiding. So why had he disappeared? A knock at my door made me flinch. I turned to see Olivia standing there, her hands gripping a clipboard too tightly. "You need to stop," she said, her voice low. I blinked at her. "Excuse me?" She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "Whatever you're looking for, let it go. This hospital," she shook her head, "they delete things that aren't supposed to be found." I frowned, my stomach nodding. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "A few months ago, I had a patient who was just a regular guy, came in for a heart issue, but when I went to pull up his previous records, they were gone. Like completely wiped." I stared at her. "I told my supervisor, and you know what he said?" She gave a hollow laugh. "If it's gone, that means it was meant to be gone. Don't ask again." My skin prickled. Olivia swallowed hard. "They make people disappear. And not just their records." A chill settled over me. "Like Dr. Strauss?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "People said he was last seen after treating a high-profile patient. Then he just vanished." I exhaled slowly, my grip tightening around the edges of my desk. This wasn't just medical confidentiality. This was something bigger, something intentional. And for the first time since this started, I realized I wasn't just up against a hospital cover-up. I was up against people who made problems disappear. I had to go back to Diddy. He was awake when I stepped into his room, staring out the window at the dark cityscape beyond. The hospital room was dim, the only light coming from the pale green glow of the monitor beside him. His IV dripped steadily, but he still refused food. I shut the door behind me, stepping closer. He didn't turn his head. "You ever hear of Dr. Leonard Strauss?" I asked. Diddy didn't react at first. Then, after a long pause, he chuckled under his breath. "Funny how doctors keep dying around me, huh?" A slow chill crept up my spine. I took another step forward. "Is that what happened to him?" Diddy exhaled, finally turning to look at me. His eyes were tired but sharp, like he had already played out this conversation before it even started. "Supposed to talk," he murmured. "Didn't know when to stop." I felt my pulse quicken. What did he know? Diddy smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just something empty. "Same thing you know now." A heavy silence settled between us. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, the distant hum of the hospital's ventilation system, the faint click, click, click of the IV machine. I swallowed hard, and what happens when someone knows too much? Diddy held my gaze, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. "What do you think?" I exhaled through my nose, turning my gaze toward the window. The skyline looked different now, the buildings less familiar, the night feeling heavier. Dr. Strauss had known something, and now he was gone. Diddy had known something, and now he was dying. And me? I had just entered the same equation. I turned back to him. "Why tell me this?" Diddy's smirk didn't fade. He just exhaled softly, leaning his head back against the pillow. "Doesn't matter now." I frowned. "Why?" For the first time, something flickered across his face, something almost like relief. "Because they already know you're looking." I left his room with my mind spiraling, my breath tight in my chest. Dr. Strauss had been the first. Was I going to be next? I needed to find out what had really happened to him. Because whatever killed him was coming for me, too. Chapter 5. The Missing Reports. I barely slept. Even when I closed my eyes, my mind kept circling back to the same questions, the same pieces that didn't fit. The phone call in the middle of the night. Dr. Strauss vanishing without a trace. The locked files. And now, the most important piece of all, Diddy's condition. He had known for years. That thought alone gnawed at me. Not just because of what it meant for him, but because of what it meant for everyone else. What was hidden in his records? Who had erased them? And why was it so important that no one found out? By the time the sun started to rise over the city, I had made up my mind. If the hospital's records were wiped, I needed to find another way in. Most people don't realize this, but hospitals never truly delete anything. Even when a file is removed from active databases, an archived copy lingers somewhere, buried in a backup system, just waiting for someone who knows where to look. And I knew exactly where to start. I logged into the hospital's internal system, my fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. The first search was simple. I typed in Sean Combs, expecting to find some trace of past records. But there was nothing. The only file linked to his name was the one from last night, completely empty aside from my own notes. I sat back, exhaling slowly. They were good. Whoever had done this wasn't just covering up test results. They were erasing his entire medical history. That meant I had to go deeper. Celebrities, especially those with money, don't use their real names when they get private treatment. If Diddy had been hiding this for years, he would have used an alias. I switched tactics, running a different search, one that filtered out the usual patient entries and flagged anything that had been manually locked or restricted. These were files the hospital's administration had deemed too sensitive for regular access. And that's when I saw it. There was a patient entry from August 2019 under the name Nathaniel Harris. The visit type was flagged as a private consultation. And the treating physician? Dr. Leonard Strauss. My breath hitched. I clicked on the file, but before I could read anything, a security prompt popped up, a login screen I wasn't supposed to have access to. I tried my credentials anyway. Access denied. I tried again. Denied. I clenched my jaw, frustration burning in my chest. This wasn't just locked for privacy. It had been restricted on an administrative level. Someone higher up had gone out of their way to make sure no one ever opened this file again. But they hadn't accounted for the system's auto-logging feature. Every time a file was modified, even if it was deleted, a trace of it remained in the backup archives. I bypassed the security screen and navigated to the hospital's internal logs, scrolling through hundreds of old entries until I found what I was looking for, the original version of the file. My heart pounded as I opened it. Diddy had tested positive for HIV in 2019. I read the words over and over again, barely able to process them. He had known for 4 years, and yet no one else did, not his publicists, not the press, not the people closest to him. I kept reading. The notes were brief, barely more than a paragraph, but they told me everything I needed to know. The patient had insisted symptoms were minor. He had requested discretion and, most importantly, he had refused standard treatment. I frowned at that last part. Why would he refuse treatment? Then, as I kept digging, I found my answer. Diddy hadn't ignored his condition. He had gone looking for a cure. I needed more. A test result from years ago was one thing, but if he had been managing this privately, there had to be a paper trail. Hospitals leave behind records, but so do insurance companies, clinics, private specialists. Someone had treated him, someone outside of Brooklyn Hospital. I switched tactics, running a search through flagged financial transactions. If Diddy had been hiding this, he wouldn't have used traditional insurance. He would have paid out of pocket. Big money. It didn't take long before I found something. A payment, large enough to make my stomach turn, had been routed through a shell corporation to a clinic in Zurich, Switzerland. Not just any clinic, a medical facility known for experimental treatments. Diddy hadn't just been looking for a way to manage his illness, he had been trying to erase it. I scrolled through the entry, my pulse hammering in my ears. The payment had been processed in December 2020. The services listed were vague, with terms like advanced immunotherapy and genetic response modification. But it was the physician's field of expertise that told me everything I needed to know. Virology and retroviral research. I exhaled sharply, leaning back in my chair. Diddy had spent millions trying to undo what couldn't be undone. I didn't even realize how much time had passed until I glanced at the clock. It was almost 6 a.m. I rubbed a hand over my face, exhaustion pulling at me, but I wasn't done. I needed to talk to him. When I stepped into his hospital room, he was awake. The dim glow of the heart monitor cast soft shadows across his face. His breathing was steady, his eyes half-lidded but alert. I walked up to his bed, stopping at the foot of it. I know. Diddy turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting mine. There was no surprise in his expression, just acceptance. I know you tested positive in 2019, I continued, my voice quieter. I know you've been hiding it, the treatments, the money you spent trying to fix it. Diddy didn't react, he just blinked slowly. You could have gotten help, I said. You could have managed this. Instead, you buried it. A slow, tired smirk curled at the corner of his lips. And I frowned. You don't care. He let out a soft exhale, barely a laugh. You think you're the first one to figure it out. The words sent a chill down my spine. How many doctors did you pay off? I asked. Diddy shrugged. Enough. And the ones who didn't take the money? He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. I clenched my jaw. Dr. Strauss. He knew, didn't he? Diddy didn't answer. He just watched me, as if waiting for me to put the rest of it together. I swallowed hard. They made him disappear. Diddy exhaled, leaning back against the pillow. You ask too many questions, Doc. My fingers tightened at my sides. "How long do you think you can keep this quiet?" I asked. That got his attention. His eyes flicked to mine again, his expression unreadable. He studied me for a long moment before speaking. "I always thought I had more time." His voice was quieter now, tired, and for the first time, I believed him. Diddy had spent years trying to outmaneuver death, but now it had finally caught up to him. The only question left was, who else was going down with him? Chapter 6. The black SUV outside my house. The world outside the hospital felt different. The air was sharp, the city too quiet. Brooklyn had never been silent, not really, but tonight there was something else in the air. A weight pressing down, a stillness that shouldn't have been there. I had been at the hospital for nearly 20 hours. My body felt heavy, my head aching from lack of sleep, but my mind was too wired to rest. Every conversation with Diddy played over in my head. His smirk, his cryptic responses, the way he never denied a single thing. He knew what was happening to me before I did. By the time I pulled into my street, the early morning glow had started to stretch over the horizon. The first thing I noticed was how quiet my apartment building looked. It was an old brownstone, nothing fancy, just functional. But tonight, something about it felt off. As I stepped out of my car, my stomach twisted. The front door was open. Not wide open, just slightly ajar, barely an inch, enough to make my pulse spike in my throat. I knew I had locked it before I left. I stood there for a long moment, my keys clutched in my hand, the weight of my bag pressing against my shoulder. My first instinct was to turn around, to get back in the car and pretend I hadn't seen it. But I had already gone too far for that. Slowly, I stepped forward. I pushed the door open with the tip of my foot, my breath held in my chest. The apartment was dark, but I could tell immediately someone had been inside. The air smelled wrong. It wasn't the usual mix of stale coffee and detergent. There was something else, a faint trace of something unfamiliar, like someone had been standing in the space too long, like their scent still clung to the air. I reached for the light switch, hesitating before flicking it on. My heart dropped. The desk in the living room was empty. I had left my laptop there before I went to the hospital, the laptop that held every piece of information I had found on Diddy, the hospital records, the Zurich clinic, Dr. Strauss. Gone. I turned quickly, checking the bookshelf where I had kept my handwritten notes. The folders had been pulled out. Pages were scattered on the floor, the contents rifled through. Someone had been looking for something. My breath came uneven now, my pulse hammering in my ears. I backed away slowly, scanning the apartment. Nothing else had been touched, just the evidence. That was the message. They weren't after my money, my TV, or my personal belongings. They were after the truth, and they had taken it. I swallowed hard, my hands curling into fists. I had been careful. I hadn't told anyone what I was doing, but somehow they still knew. And that meant they were watching. The feeling didn't leave me. I barely lasted an hour in my apartment before I grabbed my keys and left. I didn't feel safe there anymore. I wasn't sure I felt safe anywhere. The city moved on like nothing had happened, but I felt it in every step I took, in every glance over my shoulder. I parked in the hospital lot, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Then I saw it. A black SUV. It was parked at the far end of the lot, just barely visible through the glare of the streetlights. The windows were tinted, the engine running low and steady. I stared at it for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew what it was. It wasn't a coincidence. I walked into the hospital on autopilot, my mind racing. The SUV hadn't followed me inside, but I knew they were still out there, watching, waiting. I had only just stepped into my office when my phone buzzed. I flinched, pulling it from my pocket. No caller ID. I hesitated before answering. "This is Dr. Greer." Silence. A long, suffocating pause. Then, the same voice from before. The same cold, detached tone. "We warned you." The line clicked dead. I stood there, gripping the phone so tightly my fingers ached. This was real. Not paranoia, not overthinking. They knew what I had done, what I had found. And now they were making sure I understood the consequences. I let out a slow breath, shoving the phone back into my pocket. I had two choices. I could stop, walk away, pretend I never saw the files, pretend I never met Diddy, pretend none of this ever happened. Or I could keep going. But if I did, I had to be ready for whatever came next. I sat down at my desk, trying to gather my thoughts. The laptop was gone, but they hadn't erased everything. I still had access to the hospital system, still had my own memory of what I had found. But before I could even begin to figure out my next move, a new email appeared in my inbox. Subject: urgent administrative notice. I clicked on it, my stomach sinking before I even read the words. Your hospital privileges have been suspended pending review. Effective immediately, you are prohibited from accessing patient records or conducting medical procedures. I blinked. Suspended? I scrolled down, scanning the email, looking for an explanation. There was no reason given, no specific incident cited, just a cold, formal notice from the hospital board, signed off with an automated response. I leaned back in my chair, my mind reeling. They were cutting me off. This wasn't just about scaring me anymore. They were shutting me down. I exhaled slowly, my hands tightening into fists. Diddy had warned me. He had smirked in that hospital bed, talking about pawns and players, about people who thought they were in control when really they were just being moved across the board. And now I understood what he meant. I wasn't just watching the cover-up anymore. I was part of it. I didn't leave the hospital right away. I sat in my office for hours, staring at the blank screen in front of me, thinking through every step that had led me here. Someone had been inside my apartment. They took my laptop. A black SUV had followed me. They wanted me to know I was being watched. The voice on the phone had warned me. And now my hospital privileges were gone. I had two options. Stop now and they might let me walk away. Or keep going and risk finding out what happens to people like Dr. Strauss. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. I had spent my whole life believing in medicine, in logic, in truth. But now I was fighting against something I couldn't see. And I had no idea if I was going to make it out. Chapter 7. Diddy's breakdown and confession. The hospital room was dark except for the dim glow of the monitors. The steady beeping of the heart rate monitor filled the silence, each soft pulse marking the seconds that felt heavier than the last. I stood just outside Diddy's door, my hand hovering over the handle. Something in my gut told me this was different. Earlier that evening, a nurse had pulled me aside in the hallway, her face drawn tight. "He's not doing well," she murmured. "You should check on him." I had expected it. He had been deteriorating fast. But there was something in the way she said it, in the way her fingers gripped the edge of her clipboard just a little too tightly that made my stomach twist. I pushed the door open. The room smelled of antiseptic and stale air. The IV line dripped steadily, but I could tell right away, Diddy was worse. His body had grown thinner in just the past few days. His skin, once taut with the remnants of his former power, looked loose now, almost translucent under the harsh hospital lights. Beads of sweat clung to his forehead, soaking into the pillow beneath him. His eyes were half-gope, staring at nothing, his breath shallow. I stepped closer, watching the way his fingers twitched slightly against the blanket. "Diddy," my voice was low, even. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, but he didn't respond. I exhaled slowly, moving to check his vitals. His heart rate was erratic, his blood pressure dangerously low. He was slipping. Then, Just as I was about to turn away, his lips parted. I froze. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but the words sent a cold chill through me. It was supposed to stay buried, they promised me. I stared at him, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. What was supposed to stay buried? I pressed, leaning closer. His breath hitched, his chest rising and falling unevenly, his fingers curled weakly against the blanket. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. This was it. He was too weak to play games now, too delirious to hold back. He was about to confess. His eyes flickered, barely focused, but there was something behind them, a shadow of panic, of realization. They said they'd handle it, he murmured. His voice was strained, like the words were being dragged from somewhere deep inside him, somewhere he had kept locked away for years. Who? I asked. Who said they'd handle it? His lips trembled. The money, it was supposed to be enough. My chest tightened. They told me it wouldn't come to this, he continued, his breath coming in short gasps, that it would be quiet. I clenched my jaw, leaning in closer. You're talking about the cover-up. His eyes flicked to mine, just for a second. Then a laugh. Soft, almost bitter. You think I ran this? His voice cracked, his throat dry. You think I had a choice? I stiffened. What do you mean? He exhaled sharply, his fingers gripping the sheets. I was never the one in control. A deep, suffocating silence filled the room. His paranoia was unraveling. I could see it in the way his breathing quickened, in the way his gaze darted around the room like he expected someone to be standing in the shadows. His fever was spiking, his body burning up from the inside out. His mind was slipping. They're watching, he muttered. His voice was hoarse now, frantic. Even now. They know what I told you. His breathing grew more erratic. They said they'd fix it, he rasped. His fingers clawed weakly at the IV line in his arm. They told me to trust them, that it wouldn't. His body tensed suddenly, a violent shiver running through him. His eyes snapped to mine. They set me up. The words came out as a rasp, raw and broken. A cold wave crashed over me. Who? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Who set you up? His lips trembled. My own people. The words barely made it out before his body seized violently. His back arched against the bed, his fingers spasming. Get a crash cart in here, I shouted toward the hallway, my voice cutting through the stillness. Nurses rushed in, the room bursting into motion, but my mind was stuck on one thing. Diddy had named no one. But he didn't have to. His entire world had been built on power, connections, influence. And now they were turning against him. The seizure didn't last long. His body gave out before it could. By the time his muscles stopped convulsing, his breathing had weakened even more. His body was failing. His mind was crumbling. But his mouth was still spilling secrets. I stood at the foot of the bed, watching as his lips moved, his words slurred, half lost between fevered murmurs. I barely caught the first name, then another, then three more. My heart slammed against my ribs. I knew these names. Some were big, industry giants, people who had built their reputations on wealth and power. Others were less obvious but still known. He was naming the people behind the cover-up. And the worst part? I didn't think he was lying. The room had settled into a deep stillness by the time the worst of it passed. Diddy's breathing was ragged, his body limp against the sheets. The seizure had drained what little strength he had left. I knew the nurses would be back soon. The hospital staff would stabilize him, buy him a little more time. But it wouldn't be enough. He was running out of time. And so was I. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Tell me everything. His eyelids fluttered, his head lolling slightly to the side. You already know, he mumbled, barely audible. My jaw tightened. I want to hear it from you. A long, heavy pause. Then, with a faint, exhausted breath, check Strauss's files. My stomach dropped. What? But his body had gone still again. I cursed under my breath, stepping back. Dr. Strauss, the doctor who disappeared. And now Diddy, the one man who had spent years keeping secrets, was telling me to look into him. I turned toward the door, my mind spinning. Diddy had never meant to confess, but in the end, his body had betrayed him. And now, I had a new name to chase. I left the room without looking back. Whatever was buried in Dr. Strauss's files, it was big. Big enough to make him disappear. Big enough to make them erase him completely. And now, I was next in line to find out why. Chapter 8. The Midnight Revelation. The hospital halls were empty, swallowed by the late-night silence. The overhead lights flickered dimly, casting long, wavering shadows across the tile floors. It was well past visiting hours, and most of the staff had either gone home or buried themselves in paperwork, waiting for the next shift change. I should have left hours ago, but after what Diddy had whispered, check Strauss's files. There was no way I could. I needed answers. I walked through the hallway with measured steps, keeping my head down, my pulse loud in my ears. Something about the air felt heavier now. It wasn't paranoia anymore. I knew they were watching. I could feel it, lingering in the quiet corners of the hospital, hiding behind every locked door, every security camera. As I turned the corner, I stopped in front of the one person I knew still had something to hide. He was one of the last remaining doctors who had worked closely with Diddy over the years. Unlike Strauss, who had vanished, Keller had kept his head down, staying within the system, following orders. He wasn't an outsider looking in. He was on the inside. And he had survived this long by keeping his mouth shut. But I could see it now, the cracks in his silence. His office door was slightly open. Inside, the glow of a desk lamp flickered against the walls. I stepped in without knocking. Keller flinched at the sight of me. He was hunched over his desk, a pen clutched tightly in his hand, his fingers white from the grip. His eyes darted toward the door behind me before settling on my face. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered. I ignored him, stepping further inside, shutting the door quietly behind me. "Dr. Strauss," I said, my voice low. "Tell me what happened to him." Keller's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." I pulled the chair back and sat down across from him, keeping my movements slow, deliberate. "Yes, you do." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "You think you're the first one to ask these questions?" His voice was strained, barely a whisper. "You think you're the first one who thought they could dig into this and just walk away?" His hand trembled slightly as he reached for a folder, flipping it open. It was empty. I wasn't sure if that was on purpose or if he had already destroyed whatever had been inside, but his next words hit harder than anything he could have put in writing. "They made Strauss disappear," he admitted, "and they'll do the same to you." I felt my breath hitch, but I didn't let it show. "How?" I pressed. Keller exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. He looked tired, like a man who had carried too many secrets for too long. "He thought he could fix it," he murmured. "He thought if he played along, if he helped cover it up just enough, he'd be safe. But he asked too many questions. He wanted out." His eyes flicked up to mine. "There is no way out." My fingers curled into fists beneath the desk. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you known?" His lips parted slightly, as if considering whether to lie, but then he shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his throat. "A decade, at least." The weight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. For 10 years this had been hidden. 10 years of bribes, of doctors looking the other way, of medical records disappearing into thin air. "How many people died for this secret?" I asked, my voice colder now. Killer rubbed a hand over his mouth, exhaling shakily. He wasn't answering. I leaned in. "How many?" A long silence. Then finally he whispered, "Too many." My stomach churned. "Why tell me now?" I asked. "If you were willing to keep quiet for this long, why break now?" He let out a hollow chuckle. "Because you're already dead, Greer. You just don't know it yet." I didn't flinch. "You think I'm bluffing?" He leaned forward now, his voice sharper, more urgent. "Check your record. You're already flagged. Your name's already in places you don't want it to be." He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "You should have walked away the second they locked that file." I studied his face, looking for the lie. There wasn't one. They had already decided my fate. I left Keller's office with my mind spinning, my body tense. This was bigger than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just Diddy. It wasn't just a cover-up. It was a system, a machine, and I had gotten too close to its gears. I made my way down the hall, my pulse hammering. The air felt heavier now, every sound sharper. I needed to decide what to do. If I went public with this, I wouldn't make it through the week. But if I walked away, I stopped short. Outside the hospital, parked near the entrance, was the same black SUV. I inhaled slowly, steadying myself. It was waiting for me. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. If I exposed the truth, they wouldn't just come for me, they would erase me, just like Strauss. But if I did nothing, if I walked away, if I let them win, I wasn't sure I could live with that. Diddy had spent his entire life playing the game, moving pieces on the board, thinking he could stay ahead. And look at him now, alone, dying, powerless. I turned, walking back toward the hospital. I still had access to my office. My credentials might be revoked, but I had one last move left to play. Inside my desk drawer was a flash drive, and on that flash drive, everything I had found. I moved fast, plugging it into my laptop, copying the files I had salvaged, the records from Zurich, the deleted test results, the missing insurance claims. This was my insurance policy. If something happened to me, the world would know. I typed out an email, attaching every file, every detail. Then I hesitated. Who could I send this to? I thought about the media. A journalist would run with this, but I had seen what happened to people who went public with things they weren't supposed to know. I needed someone who couldn't be silenced. Someone with power. I exhaled sharply, typing in a name. Then I hit send. The files were out of my hands now. Whatever happened next, it wasn't just my fight anymore. I walked out of the hospital without looking back. The black SUV was still there. The back window rolled down slightly. I didn't stop walking. If they were going to come for me, they were going to have to do it out in the open. And I wanted them to know I wasn't afraid. Not anymore.